This is a Black Dog Woof Woof production. Hello and welcome from Kyiv. My name is John Sweeney, and I'm an old school reporter. This is a podcast about Vladimir Putin and what makes him do the things that he does. Before the war, I sat down in London with a Russian journalist who used to work in Moscow. Let's call her Veronica. So this is the list that you've made on the phone there. Let's go through it. Anatoly Sobchak.
Poisoned? ?
Roman Sepov.
Poisoned.
Yuri Shakachikin.
Poisoned.
Lechie Ismailov.
Poisoned.
Anna Politkovskaya.
Poisoned and then shot.
Alexander Litvinenko.
Poisoned.
Vladimir Karamurza.
Poisoned twice.
Still alive.
Still alive.
Sergei Skripal.
Poisoned and still alive.
Alexei Navalny.
Poisoned and still alive, hopefully.
But in prison.
But in prison.
There are 3 more people to add to that list. An unknown man, poisoned but still alive. Rustem Umarov, poisoned but still alive. Roman Abramovich, poisoned but still alive. Umarov is a Ukrainian MP and Abramovich a Russian oligarch most famous for owning Chelsea Football Club. The 3 men were poisoned in early March 2022 in Kyiv while working on a peace deal to stop the war. The Bellingcat website reported they felt intense pain in their eyes. They could not stop crying and they suffered a skin rash. Taken with all the other poisonings, this suggests that Vladimir Putin has a thing about venom. It's something I take up with Veronica. What does this list tell you about Vladimir Putin? Because all of these people were critical of Vladimir Putin.
It just terrifies me. I have no words to explain how scared I am about that and about the fact that tomorrow or next month or next year someone who I know in person might be in this list. And this is what I'm very afraid of.
Here's the catch. A few days before the launch of this podcast series, Veronica, who is a brave and good reporter, got in touch with me in Kyiv. She's still got family in Russia and she's worried sick about them, and she asked me to take her voice off. So Veronica's words have been spoken by a Ukrainian journalist, Christina. Christina, where are you from?
From Mariupol.
Mariupol is the port city on the Black Sea. It's kind of the Ukrainian version of Liverpool that's been hammered by the Russian army. Once beautiful avenues have been reduced to rubble. Hundreds of civilians have been killed, including pregnant mothers in a maternity hospital. Mariupol is where Russia's worst war crimes have been perpetrated. Thanks to the power of the Kremlin, the Russian journalist from Moscow has been silenced. The Ukrainian journalist from Mariupol has lost her home, but not her voice. The silencing of brave Russian voices is nothing new. I've met 4 people who gave Vladimir Putin a lick with the rough edge of their tongue. Anna Politkovskaya, a reporter, Natasha Estemirova, a human rights worker, Boris Nemtsov, a politician, and Alexei Navalny, an anti-corruption campaigner turned politician. In order: poisoned, later shot, poisoned twice, now in jail. This podcast is my attempt to tell the story of why so many of Vladimir Putin's enemies end up dead, and why the British authorities and people around the world have done so little to stop him. But also to try to get inside Vladimir Putin's head, to understand his psychology, to work out what drives the man inside the Kremlin machine. Here's the President of the United States, Joe Biden, being put on the spot about the true nature of Vladimir Putin.
You know Vladimir Putin, you think he's a killer?
I do.
Joe Biden is, I believe, wrong about that. The President of Russia isn't a killer. The way I see it, Vladimir Putin is a serial killer. They're not everyday killings. Military-grade nerve agents, rare radioactive isotopes are used. This way, they're sending a message intended to shut people up, But not everyone's falling silent. Not the best of Russia, not the best of Ukraine, not the best of Britain. And if you're coming along for the ride, not you either. You're listening to Taking on Putin, Episode 2, The Poisonings Begin. On Station Street in Bucha, northwest of Ukraine's capital Kiev, there is a line of Russian tanks that have been blasted by the Ukrainian army. The Russian army did not take kindly to this defeat. In someone's back garden, we find two corpses lying on the ground. The first man has been shot in the head. The second man has been shot in the face. Both bodies have turned a kind of bluey green. They were civilians in ordinary clothes, and both were executed by the Russian army. As we film the scene with our camera phones, two locals lift the dead men into white body bags and zip them up. Down the road, opposite a church in Bucha, stands a mass grave. In it, a hand reaches out to the sky. Flesh is still on the hand, but it has turned green. There are 280 bodies in the mass grave. What kind of man could do this? What drives the man behind Vladimir Putin's killing machine? Let's start at the very beginning with baby Vlad. Vladimir Putin is born in 1952 in Leningrad, what is now St Petersburg. Stalin is still in the Kremlin, one more victim of his own murderous paranoia. Towards the end of his life, Stalin wrote, "I trust no one, not even myself." Putin's grandfather had been one of Stalin's cooks. In Soviet terms, he'd been a member of the household of the Red Tsar. Despite that connection, Putin is brought up dirt poor on the wrong side of the tracks in Leningrad, the only surviving child of an elderly couple. Two older sons have died, one in infancy, one during the Nazi siege of Leningrad. When his mother has Vladimir at the age of 41, it's a kind of miracle. Maybe it's too much of a miracle. The alternative version is that Vladimir Putin is a bastard. There's an old woman, Vera Putina, an ethnic Russian living in Georgia, who's claimed since 1999 that Vladimir Putin is her long-lost bastard son. The story goes that after she had Vladimir, his birth father vanished. Vera found another man, but her new fella hated the bastard. Poor Vladimir was beaten and brutalized by his stepfather, so much so that he was given away to relatives in Leningrad, the old couple who claimed him as his mum and dad. What is striking is that Vera Putina looks very much like Vladimir Putin, astonishingly so. There is a world of hurt in this bastard story that could explain much about him. But is it true? Donald Rayfield is Emeritus Professor of Russian at London University, and author of the bestseller Stalin and His Hangmen. In his garden, he's got a lot of noisy birds.
There's sufficient proof and evidence that he was born in wedlock, the third son, but the only one to survive, of working class parents. He grew up in a very rough district of Petersburg. There's enough evidence of his youth that the old men who grew up as boys in the yard where he played, we do have a continuous record for the official story.
Vlad the teenager is nasty, brutish and short. He grows up in Soviet Leningrad in the 1960s. Later he says, 50 years ago, Leningrad streets taught me a lesson. If a fight is inevitable, strike first. Vladimir Putin is a politician, plain and simple. He has no links whatsoever with organized crime. True or false?
False.
How false?
100% false.
Zarina Zabriskie is a Russian novelist now living in the States. Her hobby is researching Vladimir Putin's gangster past. When did they start?
It started in late 80s,
early 90s. In fact, Putin was very involved into martial arts as a kid. That his whole identity is very tied into judo, the martial arts that he learned in St. Petersburg. So his coach in his club, Leonid Usvyatsev, was known as a gangster. He had a very big presence in Putin's life. He actually helped Putin to get into the university because Putin was a very poor student, but there was a special quota for athletes.
Yes, you heard that correctly. Young Putin got into university on an athletic scholarship. The pupil master of young Putin, Leo the sportsman, he's connected.
He trained under Leonid Usvyatsev, who was a professional wrestler, a stuntman, and an organized crime group boss. He had 2 convictions for group rape and currency fraud and spent almost 20 years in prison.
And is this man, Leonid, a big mentor for Vladimir Putin?
He was, according to Putin, who refers to various experience with Leonid in his memoirs, he was. And his grave actually says, it reads, "A grave, on the grave an epitaph. I'm dead, but immortal is mafia."
You're joking?
No, I'm not. I have a photograph of the grave.
So, years before Putin becomes a spy, he's hanging out with a gangster. Many of the friends Putin makes in the martial arts club are still part of his gang now. And guess what? Some of them are billionaires. Young Vlad's dream comes true and he signs up for the KGB. For many young Russians, joining the KGB was a ticket out of poverty. But Putin is posted to Dresden in East Germany, inside the Warsaw Pact, a far shot from New York or Paris or London. But while he's in Dresden, Vladimir Putin's world starts collapsing around him. The Soviet Union starts imploding from within, brought down by 3 catastrophic failures. The first, the long, stupid war in Afghanistan, started on Christmas Eve 1979. The Russian army generals knew the war would be a mistake, but no one dared tell the master of the Kremlin. Back then, Leonid Brezhnev. Shades of 2022. The second catastrophe, the explosion in the nuclear power station at Chernobyl in then Soviet Ukraine. Here's my fixer, Eugene, who before the war was a professor of nuclear physics. Actually, I made that up. He was a tour guide at Chernobyl, but he knows his nukes.
When I used to be a tour guide, I used to tell the reason it has exploded is that on the day of the explosion, the chief of the nuclear power plant was given an order to carry out a special test. But to do that, they needed to go around the several security systems. So once they started heating and accelerating the turbine, the nuclear fuel inside of the fuel rod started heating and basically melting down on the reactor. So the water that was supposed to cool down the rods turned into vapor, and the vapor contacted with the fission reaction elements of the reactor of the nuclear fuel, which gone to the explosion.
So essentially, in kind of layman's English, it's like boiling a kettle dry.
Absolutely.
And then bang, disaster.
That's the hydrogen bomb.
So, but there was a problem with this particular reactor, which the Soviet authorities had hushed up.
Absolutely. Even the chief of the nuclear power plant that was the head, that was the responsible and accountable for running out that test, he actually and the whole team, they didn't know about the fact that this kind of nuclear reactor could ever explode. But there were explosions before, but as you already said.
It had been hushed up.
Yeah.
By the way, after the explosion, Ukraine built an enormous coffin made of concrete to entomb the broken reactor. When the war started, The Russian army shelled it, but so far it's held. The third catastrophe, well, that's been a long time in the making. The command economy could not compete with the West's free markets. The Soviet Union was broke, its people fed up. Putin, the secret policeman, never quite grasped what happened. He went on to lament that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. What? Worse than the First and Second World Wars? Worse than the Holocaust? The Soviet Union was, in reality, a dark totalitarian dictatorship under Stalin that slowly morphed into a gloomy senescence. With his tail between his legs, Putin heads back home to St Petersburg to work for the mayor, Anatoly Sobchak. There's a photo of him carrying the mayor's bags. I ask the Russian journalist I'm calling Veronica what she makes of the photo. Does he look that attractive, interesting, powerful?
Absolutely not. It's just very skinny guy with very pale skin, with very light and red hair. Just holding bags, if you're just carrying bags mostly.
So Vlad the bagman looks a bit sad, moon-faced, small, very, very unimportant. But behind the scenes, Vladimir Putin is reconnecting with friends of his old judo coach, Leo the sportsman. That is, the mafia, the Russian mob. So, what's his role in St. Petersburg?
It's a racketeering.
Professor Donald Rayfield doesn't mince his words about the mayor and the man who carried his bags.
Anatoly Sobchak, he was mayor, and he had a reputation of being a Democrat and a liberal. And of course, it's possible to be a Democrat and a liberal and a complete con man at the same time. So certainly he didn't arrest people, and Sobchak may not have ordered anyone's killing, but I think his bagman was probably a little more ruthless.
So Putin became the deputy mayor at some point?
Yes.
One of a number of deputy mayors, or just the main? He became the main one towards the end.
He became the main one, yeah. There are a lot of people muscling in on this racket.
Was there a brush with organised crime?
Not exactly a brush. Organised crime realised, I think, quite early on that they had to have a deal. And that there was a lot of money about, a lot of contracts, and they could now expand abroad, which they hadn't done before. But before that, the organised crime in Russia was almost a sort of cult, a monastic cult. But they adapted very quickly to the KGB people who had the money and the contacts. And I think that's basically what has happened in Russia. There's been a merger of secret police and mafia. Disastrous for the people.
Putin the ex-spy gets closer to the Tambov crime gang. One big player in it is Roman Sepov. Reportedly, Sepov is so thick with Putin that he gives his wife Lyudmila an emerald stolen from South Korea. For a time, the gangsters and their deputy mayor get on like a house on fire.
The carve-up has been made. A small group of oligarchs, some of whom began their lives as criminals, who promised not to interfere in politics, and Putin promises to let them keep their wealth.
And in return, they and their money must be loyal to Putin.
They must be, yes, or they're dead.
Play that again. They and their money must be loyal to Putin.
They must be, yes, or they're dead.
What goes for the oligarchs goes for everyone else too. In St. Petersburg, Mayor Sobchak loses an election, and Putin is out of a job. But he pops back up in the Kremlin, and outgoing President Yeltsin makes him his contender to succeed him. In the middle of the election, Putin, the presidential wannabe, has a problem. Sobchak is back, and he's not being helpful. And then something happens to Sobchak. Here's Veronica, who used to work in Moscow.
Officially, it was a heart attack, but he was quite a young person. He wasn't old and he wasn't very sick at the moment.
He looked quite healthy.
Yes. He was quite active, really, that very energized all the time and so on. And before it happened, he started a campaign, like a political campaign. He had a heart attack and that's it. But the interesting fact is that he wasn't alone. There were two, as it said, there were two bodyguards that were stand with him to protect him. And also it is said that these two people, still unknown, by the way, had heart attacks as well.
So he had a heart attack, but his two bodyguards had heart attacks as well.
Yeah.
That sounds like that they suffered symptoms of poisoning.
Yeah. They also had symptoms of heart attacks. That's why it suggested it was poisoning. But at the same time, his wife, his widow, she made her own tests, I believe, of blood after his death, and she decided that she got the result, but now it's never going to be published, and that she keeps this result in the very protected place outside Russia.
So she's using the post-mortem results into her own late husband's death as a kind of insurance policy, lest something happened to her.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Because if she keeps it outside the country, what is the reason then?
There's another guy called Roman Sepov, and he was a gangster in the Tambov gang, or connected to the Tambov gang in St Petersburg, dealing directly with Vladimir Putin when he was deputy mayor. What happened to Roman Sepov?
He was poisoned. Yeah, he was poisoned.
Why are you laughing?
Because, everyone seems to be poisoned. That's why I'm laughing.
By the way, I'm laughing too. It's a joke, but not a funny one. Roman Sepov's poisoning was far from a one-off. As far as the poisoning of Vladimir Putin's enemies go, we're just taxiing down the runway. You've been listening to Taking on Putin, Episode 2. The Poisonings Begin. Next week, here's a British boffin who knows his radioactive poisons like the back of his hand.
They realized that it was special, both because Litvinenko was a Russian with a particular background in intelligence, and because of his symptoms, to say this is strange. It looks like radiation, but we can't measure the radiation. And they sent the samples from Litvinenko's body fluids to Aldermaston. And Aldermaston did some tests. They looked for particular nuclear decays, and they found two: alpha radiation of a particular energy, and also gamma radiation, which was much weaker, but they could detect it, and again it had a particular energy. And measuring these two, alpha and gamma, identified the element, the isotope, as polonium-210. There was no doubt that it was polonium-210.
Can you buy polonium-210 in a shop?
No.
Listen out next week for Taking on Putin Episode 3, One Lump or Two. Taking on Putin is a podcast series written and reported by me, John Sweeney, for Black Dog Wolf Wolf Productions. A ton of people have helped make this podcast possible. Some of them, at the moment, would prefer to be anonymous. You may understand why. I've launched a crowdfunder to help fund this. There are lots of costs: lawyers checking things out, getting it recorded, making sure that it all goes to the right platforms, making sure that the people that I'm working with and I are safe from legal and other threats. I'm not going to spell them out, but use your imagination. So, if you can help me tell this story and make this podcast, please help me crowdfund it. Go to crowdfunder.co.uk and look up Taking on Putin with me, John Sweeney. Thank you for listening, and thank you for coming along for the ride. Take care, and love from Kiev.